Hello, you're watching Global Insights, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. I'm Ku-youn. The Indo-Pacific has become the most talked about region in global politics. Spanning the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the area accounts for some 60% of the world's population, maritime trade and global GDP. It's also a theatre of territorial and maritime disputes and the stage for the hegemonic rivalry between Washington and Beijing. Amid the growing challenges to the security and stability of the Indo-Pacific, countries have been releasing their strategies for the region in order to guard the sea lines of communication and the freedom of navigation that are vital to their interests. We discuss what South Korea's own Indo-Pacific strategy is likely to look like, and for this we're joined by Ku-youn, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Kangwon National University, and Mason RICHEY, Professor of International Politics at the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. It's lovely to see you both. And well, my first question goes to you, Dr. RICHEY. Well, most nations, they actually released their Indo-Pacific strategies a number of years ago, mostly about 2 years ago. And well, what is the significance of South Korea releasing its own Indo-Pacific strategy after all this time?
Yeah, so, in the first place, I think this cashes in one of President Yoon's campaign promises and one of the important parts of his overall presidential foreign policy, which is to say cooperating more closely with the United States in order to have a platform or a foundation for being able to have more regional and global influence under the banner of what the Yoon administration sometimes refers to as South Korea as a global pivotal state. As we know, the United States has been refocusing increasingly on the Indo-Pacific region. And so this is a one way for South Korea to follow along with that movement of its close alliance partner and security guarantor. And in so doing, to hopefully, from the Yoon administration's perspective, be able to branch out and take more seriously and take more responsibility for protecting trade routes, international navigation, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and other notably maritime related issues in the Indo-Pacific region. So that's one thing that's significant about it. I think another is that it allows South Korea to find areas of potential cooperation with other states that have Indo-Pacific strategies. Germany has one, the Netherlands has one, France has one, the European Union has one. And so this is a way for South Korea, again, to extend its influence a little bit regionally by finding some areas of overlap with some of its European partners here in the region as well. And thirdly, I think this reflects a little bit of a chance to assert itself regionally in a way that hopefully doesn't irritate China, but shows just enough that South Korea is willing to assert itself regionally, and at the same time, not in such a dramatic way that Beijing will respond in a particularly rebarbative fashion.
I see. And Professor Chung, well, what interest does South Korea have in protecting the freedom of navigation in the very contentious areas of the Indo-Pacific?
Well, South Korea's economic growth and development so far has heavily depended on the trade. So it will be likely in the future as well. So the current administrations, as Rich mentions, try to secure the freedom of navigation in the region, and more broadly speaking, rule-based order in the maritime domains as well. That means that the current Yoon administrations perceive the level of revisionism in the maritime domain is pretty severe. It is not the time that we have any kind of leisure to hedge the great power competition between U.S. and China, but we are trying to sticking to our identity as well as the kind of principle of rule-based orders, so that we can have our freedom of navigation in the region.
And Professor Chung, well, what are some key overlaps and also differences between the United States and Europe's approach to the Indo-Pacific?
Well, as many countries, as Professor Rich mentions, many countries have Indo-Pacific strategies, and especially with the U.S. and the European Union, they share the assumptions that the rule-based order in the region is pretty important. The broader goal of kind of in the region has been shared between two countries, but at the same time, the difference is that whether they have the components of inclusivity. Well, United States perceive China as a competitor and kind of target of great power competition. But at the same time, European unions and many other European countries actually perceive China as a partner as well. Of course, there was a kind of strategic concept generated by NATO, but at the same time, European countries have a kind of economic interdependence with China and also Russia as well. So they try to have a kind of inclusive architecture in the regions and try to be more accommodating most of the countries in the Indo-Pacific region.
And Professor Ritchie, well, when South Korea releases its full-fledged Indo-Pacific strategy, what do you think we're really going to see, particularly in regards to China? Do you think South Korea is going to be a bit more assertive about the Taiwan Strait or freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, for instance?
Yeah, so I think, from what I gather from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to the extent that I've been able to divine this and figure it out, I do not expect this Indo-Pacific strategy to intentionally irritate or cross swords with China. I think one of the things that we're going to see, is that the concept of, geographically speaking, of the Indo-Pacific is going to be quite expansive. That it's very likely going to include, perhaps even as far as East Africa, over into the Western Pacific, which would make it very close to, for instance, what the European Union's geographic coverage is for its own Indo-Pacific strategy. I don't know that for a fact. There could be some revisions, but that's what I think is going to be the case. And that's intentional because indeed South Korea would like to establish this Indo-Pacific strategy in a way that allows it to grow its influence in the region, that allows it to press for the rules-based order, as Professor Chung just mentioned, and to work with the United States and other partners in this area, but without irritating China unnecessarily. So South Korea is standing up for itself, is standing up for the rules-based order, standing up for international trade and freedom of navigation, among other things, but it doesn't want to do so in a way that intentionally irritates Beijing. So my guess is we're not going to see something specific, for instance, about Taiwan. That seems like that would violate that principle. I think we'll see much more general statements about the need to protect the rules-based international order, and that will, of course, be a message to China and to other, potentially revisionist states in the region that South Korea will work with its allies and partners, through the means of international law and through strategic competition where necessary in order to assert that rule of law. What we'll also see, of course, is some specific areas that are mentioned. For instance, counter-piracy, possibly cyber, maritime security of various forms, obviously, freedom of navigation in sea lines of communication, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So I think we'll see a mixture of some geographic focus along with some functional area focus as well, all under the larger tent of protecting the rules-based international order.
Right, and those things would pretty much be in line with what the Foreign Minister Park Jin has said as well, South Korea seeking its own national interest. And Professor Chung, well, for Seoul, its greatest security threat always has been and still is pretty much North Korea. So in the midst of all these countries pivoting towards the Indo-Pacific and looking at the sort of wider security concerns there, how do you think Seoul will really keep the North Korea agenda alive?
Well, given that United States more focus on U.S.-China competition, you can see that North Korea issue can be kind of deprioritized in terms of diplomatic issues. But at the same time, when you're looking at the Indo-Pacific strategy documents provided by United States a few weeks ago, it says that North Korea's threat is a kind of Indo-Pacific threat. It is not just contained in Northeast Asia theater, but at the same time, it is kind of actually the missile from North Korea can reach to the United States mainland and in the Pacific Command in the Hawaii and Guam and the entire region in the Indo-Pacific. So in that sense, North Korea threat is not just about Northeast Asia threat. So this North Korea agenda can be alive in the United States and regional countries' diplomatic profile. And as you can see from this audacious initiative provided by the Yoon Suk-yeol administrations, it emphasized the components of dissuasion and deterrence, which is pretty kind of coincided with the United States agenda in terms of North Korea policy. So as you can see from the latest news that U.S. forces Korea invited Space Forces, and United States and Japan and South Korea trilateral cooperation focusing on North Korea threats and deterring their missile kind of launches. So all of this agenda can still alive, and it is very important to make this agenda alive, I think.
And Professor Chung, let me ask you another question. Well, it seems that the United States, it's really looking to Japan as a major actor in the Indo-Pacific region as the main sort of partner to offset China. Then where does that really place South Korea?
Well, the major goal of ROK-U.S. alliances is to deter North Korea's provocation and maintain stability in the Korean Peninsula in Northeast Asia. But given that, as I mentioned earlier, given that North's threat gets diversified and intensified, South Korea's role is important more than any other time, not only for the Northeast Asia, but also across the Western Pacific. So South Korea's role is not just limited to North Korea, but just kind of maintaining stability in the region as well. But at the same time, as Professor Rich mentioned, South Korea's role as a global pivotal state argues that South Korea play a bigger role in the Indo-Pacific as well. We are increasing in our roles and kind of commitment in the region, but at the same time, we are making a kind of broader alignment network with regional countries. So I think we can contribute our role and our effort to broader regions and contribute our role to maintain our stability to offset China in the future as well.
Right, and certainly with the change of administration earlier this year in May, we saw South Korea becoming, more willing to engage in these U.S.-led activities in the Indo-Pacific. And well, Dr. Richey, now some people think that South Korea, Japan, Australia, and the U.S. they're shaping up to be a newer version of the Quad, which was originally, of course, Japan, Australia, India, and the U.S. And well, where did India go, and what's your view on this new Quad theory?
I don't think India's going anywhere. I'm not sure that I'm in agreement with whoever those people are who make that statement. I think that the Quad still exists in its prior form and is advancing. Next year, Australia will host in Sydney the next Quad leaders meeting. India will be there. I can only assume that some people whom you've referenced might have made that argument because India has extended only very tepid support to U.S. efforts to condemn Russia for its wanton violation of Ukrainian sovereignty with this horrific war that Vladimir Putin has unleashed in Ukraine. But I think we need to keep issues separate from each other. And at the end of the day, the United States is still an important partner for India and the reverse. And with all due respect to South Korea, it certainly can't replace India's geopolitical weight in the Indo-Pacific region. So India hasn't gone anywhere. I think it's important that South Korea, continues to grow its role in the Indo-Pacific, and that means working with the United States. That means working closer with Australia. Those things are happening, obviously, and we're even seeing, South Korea make efforts to work better with Japan. But among other things, I think one of the reasons why we would definitely say that we need to perhaps pump the brakes a little bit on this new Quad without India and including South Korea is indeed the fact that Japan and South Korea are still not on the same page about any number of very critical bilateral domestic political issues. And that sort of prevents, in some ways, some of the deeper cooperation that we find among the Quad on some of these security issues, notably in the Indo-Pacific region. And I don't see that changing anytime soon, even if South Korea wanted that to be the case. And frankly speaking, I'm not sure that South Korea wants or needs that responsibility because, as I mentioned, that's going to almost certainly mean crossing swords with Beijing. And at the moment, Seoul's, even under Yoon, relatively careful to do that. So I think we need to keep these groupings perhaps separate a little bit and not be so far out over our skis.
Right. Well, there's still some time to go until the South Korean government fully unveils its Indo-Pacific strategy, but I suppose, according to you both, we'll see something that gives it a broader role in the area, but doesn't, irritate or irk any other countries around it, as of course Seoul is, as ever, always in a very precarious position in this part of the world. Thank you so much for your time today. That was Ku-youn, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Kangwon National University, and Mason RICHEY, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Also, thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Global Insight will be back tomorrow at the same time on Arirang News, so please do tune in then. Have a great day wherever you are. Goodbye.